Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a close look at some interesting research, specifically a paper called GBSVR, Granular Ball Support Vector Regression.
Right, by Rostogi and colleagues. And it's definitely worth looking at because it addresses a pretty significant challenge with a really useful machine learning tool, Support Vector Regression, or SVR.
SVR.
Yeah.
It's great for complex data, nonlinear stuff. It can be really accurate for prediction.
Super accurate. It's like drawing this really flexible boundary or line through your data points. But, and this is the big but, it gets incredibly expensive, computationally speaking, when you throw large data sets at it.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
That OM cubed complexity is a killer. Like, try running that on massive data streams. Not practical.
Exactly. And the paper also brings up another point. SVR can be kind of sensitive to outliers. Those weird data points that just don't fit.
Yeah, it can really mess up the model.
Mm-hmm. So the mission here basically is how do we keep the good parts of SVR, the accuracy, but make it faster for big data and tougher against those outliers?
And that's where this GBSVR comes in, Granular Ball Support Vector Regression.
Yep. And the core idea is actually quite neat. They group similar data points together into these things they call granular balls.
Okay. Granular balls.
So instead of the model looking at every single point one by one, it deals with these like summaries, these balls of data.
Right. It's like summarizing a huge document down to bullet points.
Yeah.
You get the main ideas, lose maybe some tiny details, but it's way faster to read.
Precisely. Much less work for the algorithm.
So what are the key takeaways, the main contributions of this paper then?
Well, first, obviously, is proposing GBSVR itself. This mix of granular computing, which is about dealing with data in chunks, and SVR.
Okay, the hybrid approach.
Second, and this is quite clever for regression tasks, they figured out a new way to build these granular balls when you're trying to predict a continuous number, not just classify things. They call them granular regression balls.
Ah, okay, so it's tailored for regression specifically.
Exactly. And finally, they tested it. Put it through its paces on standard benchmark data, time series data too.
Which is notoriously tricky.
Right. And the results seem to show it performs really well, sometimes even better than the standard methods. And crucially, it's faster. Less computational grunt needed.
Faster and potentially more accurate or robust.
Yeah.
That's kind of the holy grail for large-scale ML.
Pretty much. The paper itself is structured quite logically. Starts with the background, regression, SVR, its strengths.
And its weaknesses, the speed issue, the memory needed, that whole quadratic programming thing.
Mm-hmm. And the outlier sensitivity again. Then they introduce granular computing as this way to handle big, maybe imprecise data using these granular balls.
The potential benefits being, better handling of noise, and maybe even making the results easier to understand.
Yeah, potentially, because you're grouping related things. Then they naturally lead into GBSVR as the solution integrating these ideas.
And they outline the rest. Related work, their model, the experiments, conclusion, standard structure.
Yep. In the related work, they recap standard SVR, that epsilon-insensitive idea, trying to fit a function within a certain error tolerance, that epsilon tube.
Right, minimizing complexity while staying close to the data points, but not too close. Those slack variables come in there too.
Correct. And they reiterate the computational cost, mention things like chunking or SMO that help but don't fully solve the scalability problem for really big data.
And touch on robust SVR variants, acknowledging others have tried to tackle the outlier problem before.
Then they properly introduce granular ball computing. Define the ball, BCR, center C, radius R, just basic geometry, Euclidean distance.
How do they calculate the center and radius typically?
Usually the center is just the mean of the points in the ball. The radius, it could be the max distance from the center or sometimes the mean distance. They actually argue for the mean distance later, saying it's better for robustness.
Okay. And they mentioned it's been used elsewhere.
Oh yeah. Clustering, classification, even label denoising. But they point out not really explored much for regression. That's the gap they're filling.
They also mention a previous attempt, right? MGSVR.
Ah, yes. The controllable multigranularity support vector algorithm. They critique it a bit.
How so?
They argue it wasn't totally clear how it mapped regression values to the granular balls. Seemed like it ignored the actual target values when building the balls.
Which sounds counterintuitive for regression.
Right. And some, let's say, inconsistencies in the math description, they basically position GBSVR as a more rigorous, consistent approach that does consider the regression values properly.
Okay, so that sets the stage nicely for their proposed model.
Yeah.
How do they actually build these granular regression balls?
So this is the core technical bit. They need these balls to summarize the data effectively for a regression task. Standard clustering balls aren't quite right.
Because the goal isn't just grouping similar inputs, but inputs that lead to similar outputs.
Precisely. So their solution is quite interesting. It's a two-step thing. First, they take the continuous target variable, the thing you're trying to predict, and discretize it.
Right.
They chop it up into a fixed number, say k, of distinct bins or intervals. Each interval gets a unique label, like turning a temperature scale into cold, mild, hot.
Okay, so you turn the continuous output into categories first.
Yes. Then, when they form a granular ball around some input data points, they look at the discretized labels of the corresponding target values for those points.
Ah, I see.
And they define the quality of that ball based on how many points inside it share the same discretized label. The majority label, basically.
So a good ball is one where most of the input points lead to outputs in the same category or bin.
Exactly. And they argue this makes it robust to noise. A few outlier target values won't change the majority label of the ball.
Makes sense.
Then they set up an optimization problem. Find a set of these granular regression balls that cover the data, minimize the number of balls and their size, radius, but ensure each ball meets a minimum quality threshold, T.
So you end up with fewer high-quality representative balls instead of millions of raw data points.
That's the goal. Let's say you go from original points down to ungranular balls, where n is much, much smaller than m. Each ball, GRBE, has a center psi, radius ρ, and crucially, an average target value E, calculated from the original target values of the points inside it.
Okay, got the balls. Now, how do they plug these into SVR?
They go back to that epsilon tube idea from standard SVR. The intuition is geometrier. They want the entire granular ball, including its furthest points, to ideally fit within that epsilon error margin around the final regression function.
So the radius I of the ball plays a role here.
It does. They derive new constraints for the SVR optimization problem based on the ball's center psi, its radius ρ, and its average target value E. Essentially, the radius helps define how much wiggle room is needed within the epsilon tube to accommodate all the points represented by that ball.
So the SVR optimization is now working with N constraints based on the balls instead of M constraints based on the original point.
Exactly. And since M, the computation should be drastically reduced.
That addresses the scalability. But what about noisy data, where maybe a whole ball doesn't fit nicely?
Right. That's where the soft margin idea comes in, just like in standard SVR. They introduce slack variables, an xi, and a penalty parameter c.
Allowing some balls to violate the constraints slightly, but you pay a penalty for it in the optimization.
Correct. It makes the model more flexible for real-world messy data. They then derive the whole Lagrangian and the final dual optimization problem for this soft margin GBSVR, which is what gets solved. And they provide algorithms for the whole process generating balls, then training GBSVR.
Okay, the theory sounds solid. It links the granular idea directly to the SVR mechanics. How did it perform in practice? The experiment section.
Yeah, this is where they show their workings. They used Python, standard hardware, kicked off with synthetic data.
The sine and cosine waves you mentioned?
Yep, types A and B. But they added different kinds of noise, including heteroscedastic noise, where the noise level itself varies.
More realistic, often?
Definitely. Tables 1 and 2 show the results comparing GBSVR against standard SVR and new SVR.
And how did GBSVR do?
It did really well, consistently matched or beat the others, especially under noisy conditions. It suggests that balling up approach really does help handle noise better.
Okay, promising on synthetic data. What about benchmarks?
They used a bunch of standard UCI datasets. Table 3 lists them. Did fivefold cross-validation, used the RBF kernel, which is common for SVR.
And the results are in Table 4.
Yes. Across multiple metrics, R, MSE, MAE, RMSE, GBSVR generally came out on top.
Consistently better.
Pretty consistently, yeah. And they did another neat experiment, adding noise. They took some training samples and deliberately added Gaussian noise, ramping it up from 0% to 20%.
To explicitly test robustness.
Exactly. And GBSVR's performance degraded much less than standard SVRs as the noise increased. It held up better.
And crucially, the computation time.
Also in Table 4, GBSVR was significantly faster, orders of magnitude faster in some cases.
Wow, okay, so faster and more robust on benchmarks. That's compelling.
Definitely. But they didn't stop there. They tried it on real-world problems, too.
Like stock prices.
Yep. 5 years of stock data predicting the closing price using a sliding window for features. Compared GBSVR, SVR, no SVR again.
And GBSVR won again?
According to Table V, yes. Better performance across the board for different stocks. Figure 4 shows some plots of actual versus predicted for Apple and Google.
And the other real-world test.
Short-term wind speed prediction. Used a large data set, 1-minute intervals over 25 days. Again, split train test, set up the input features to predict future wind speed.
Another noisy time series type problem.
Exactly. Table 6 shows the results for predicting 20 or 30 minutes ahead. GBSVR outperformed the others here too. Figure 5 has the visualizations.
So across synthetic, benchmark, and real-world data, GBSVR seems to consistently deliver on speed and robustness, often with better accuracy.
That's what the experiments suggest, yeah. They also did an ablation study.
Testing how sensitive the model is to its own parameters.
Right. They focused on 2 key GBSVR parameters. That purity threshold for ball quality and the minimum number of points needed to form a ball.
What did they find?
For purity, figure 6, higher purity generally led to better performance, which makes sense. Cleaner balls mean less noise confusing the model.
Okay. And the minimum points per ball?
That was interesting, figure 7. Performance improved as you increased the minimum number of points up to a certain point, then it started to decline.
Why decline?
Probably because if the balls get too big in general, they lose the specific local patterns you want SVR to capture. There's a sweet spot. For the data set they used, it was around 4 points minimum.
So hyperparameter tuning is still important.
Oh, absolutely, as with most ML models. And finally, they compared GBSVR directly against that older Con-MGSVR method they'd critiqued.
On artificial data?
Yes. Figures 8 and 9 show it. Con-MGSVR struggled with nonlinear patterns, likely because, as they suspected, it wasn't properly using the regression values when making the balls. GBSVR captured the nonlinearities much better.
Reinforcing the value of their specific granular regression ball approach.
Exactly.
So, wrapping up the paper's conclusions, GBSVR looks like a really solid contribution. It offers a way to use SVR on larger, noisier data sets without the usual computational pain.
Yeah, it seems efficient, robust, and accurate based on their extensive tests. That novel discretization method for building the regression balls is key.
Reduces cost, improves noise handling. Seems like a win-win, especially for time series and other challenging data.
And they suggest future work, like scaling it further, maybe finding other ways to do that initial discretization step.
Okay, great summary. That brings us to our novel notions section.
Yeah.
Where could these ideas go next? The core concept is using these aggregate granular representations. Where else could that be useful in ML?
Well, it's an interesting thought. We talked about granular balls being used in clustering, which is unsupervised learning. Could we push that further in unsupervised, maybe anomaly detection?
How would that work?
Imagine you learn what normal data looks like by representing typical patterns as these granular balls. Maybe you define balls that cover the dense regions of your normal data.
Okay.
Then a new data point comes in. If it falls way outside any of these normal granular balls, maybe it's an anomaly.
Huh. So the balls define normalcy, and distance from the balls indicates strangeness.
Sort of. You'd need to figure out the right metrics, the right thresholds, how far is too far, how do you define the balls from normalcy, but the core idea of using aggregated regions seems applicable.
That's cool. What about, say, making models more understandable? Explainable AI.
That's another angle. Complex models like deep nets are often black boxes. Could a granular approach help? Maybe instead of explaining decisions based on individual features, you could explain them based on which region or granular ball the input falls into.
Like this input is similar to this group of known examples, the ball, which typically leads to outcome Y.
Exactly. It offers a higher level of abstraction. You could potentially learn rules not just on data points, but on these granular concepts. It might make the model's logic easier for humans to grasp.
You need ways to visualize these balls and the relationships between them, I suppose.
For sure. Visualization and developing the methods to extract those higher level rules would be key research challenges. But it points towards using aggregation not just for efficiency, but for interpretability too.
So the big idea here isn't just GBSVR for regression, but the potential of granular computing or data aggregation more broadly?
I think so. It's about finding the right level of abstraction. Sometimes stepping back from individual data points and looking at group behavior can unlock new ways to build models that are faster, more robust, or even potentially more understandable.
Really fascinating stuff. Lots to think about there. For anyone wanting to get into the nitty-gritty of GBSVR itself, the paper link is in the description.
Definitely worth a read if you work with regression on large data sets.
And remember, these novel notions are just that, ideas to spark further thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.